Tonight, we revisit the bleakest epoch in American history, a period when countrymen waged war against each other, when families fractured due to differing beliefs, and when the very essence of a burgeoning nation hung precariously in the balance. This is the narrative of the American Civil War, a confrontation so catastrophic that it would claim more American lives than all other wars combined. So, before you settle in, kindly take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate the content I create. And let me know in the comments your point of origin and the current time where you are. It's perpetually fascinating to observe who is joining us globally. Now, dim the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for a gentle ambient hum, and let us commence tonight's exploration together. The year was 1819, and the United States of America teetered on the brink of disaster. 11 states abided by free labor, while 11 states upheld the institution of slavery. Externally, it appeared as though perfect accord prevailed, a fragile equilibrium that sustained the nascent republic. However, beneath this facade of balance, a far more ominous development was unfolding. The nation that had proclaimed all individuals as equals was struggling with the fundamental paradox at its core. How could a country established on the principles of freedom continue to hold 4 million human beings in bondage? The architects of the nation had foreseen this eventuality. Thomas Jefferson himself had penned a denunciation of slavery within the Declaration of Independence, but the apprehension of alienating Southern support necessitated its omission. They had deferred the issue, trusting that subsequent generations would resolve what they could not. Yet, as the nation expanded westward, that inevitable confrontation had materialized with the force of a thunderclap. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had seemed, at the time, to offer a resolution. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and a demarcation would be established across the continent at 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. All territories situated north of this line would be free. All those south would be open to the practice of slavery. Henry Clay, the esteemed negotiator, had orchestrated this intricate arrangement, believing he had permanently settled the contentious issue of slavery. His conviction proved to be profoundly mistaken. Nevertheless, even as political figures celebrated their ingenious solution, the economic and cultural divergence between the North and the South widened like a vast chasm. The North was undergoing rapid industrialization, its urban centers populated by immigrants from Ireland and Germany, its factories buzzing with the promise of advancement. The South remained predominantly agrarian, its economy sustained by the labor of enslaved individuals toiling on extensive plantations under the oppressive sun. Cotton reigned supreme, and slavery was its indispensable foundation. The innovation of the cotton gin in 1793 had irrevocably transformed the Southern economy. What had previously been a laborious process of separating cotton fibers from seeds could now be accomplished mechanically, rendering cotton production exceptionally lucrative. However, this technological leap came at a terrible cost. It solidified the institution of slavery, elevating its economic value and bolstering its defense to unprecedented levels. The peculiar institution, as Southerners euphemistically referred to it, transcended mere social structure. It became the bedrock of their entire existence. In the North, a different kind of societal transformation was underway. The Second Great Awakening had permeated the region like wildfire, ushering in a renewed emphasis on moral reform and social justice. Prominent abolitionists, such as William Lloyd Garrison, disseminated impassioned publications denouncing slavery as an affront to God and humanity. The Underground Railroad, a clandestine network of safe houses and courageous operatives, facilitated the escape of thousands of enslaved individuals to freedom in the northern states and Canada. Nonetheless, even among Northerners, attitudes toward slavery were multifaceted and frequently contradictory. Many opposed slavery not out of genuine concern for the well-being of Black Americans, but rather from a fear that enslaved labor would undermine the wages of white workers. Others were apprehensive that the proliferation of slavery would concentrate excessive political influence in the hands of Southern planters. The moral argument against slavery, while gaining traction, remained but one voice amidst a cacophony of economic and political considerations. The palpable tension echoed through the halls of Congress, where representatives from the North and South regarded each other with escalating suspicion. Each new territory seeking statehood posed a threat to the fragile equilibrium. Every deliberation over tariffs or infrastructure projects devolved into a proxy conflict between competing visions for America's future. The center could not hold, and astute observers on both sides began to question the Union's long-term viability. In the slave quarters of the Southern plantations, 4 million African Americans endured subjugation, their lives entirely dictated by masters who possessed the power to buy, sell, whip, or kill them with impunity. Families were irrevocably fractured at public auctions, children separated from their parents, and spouses torn apart from one another. The psychological toll of slavery was as devastating as its physical brutality. Yet even amidst profound oppression, enslaved individuals preserved their humanity, their cultural heritage, and their aspirations for liberty. They sang spirituals that spoke of liberation, recounted tales that maintained their ancestral legacy, and never relinquished the conviction that one day, by some means, they would be free. The free black population in the North confronted its own set of adversibilities. Although legally free, they encountered discrimination at every turn. The majority of states denied them suffrage, the right to serve on juries, or access to public education. They were excluded from numerous professions and compelled to reside in segregated communities. Nevertheless, they persevered, establishing churches, schools, and businesses, and emerging as some of the most articulate proponents of the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery but self-educated and possessing extraordinary intellect, became one of the most compelling orators of his generation. His addresses and writings exposed the atrocities of slavery to audiences throughout the North and in Europe. As the 1840s commenced, the issue of slavery's expansion grew increasingly critical. The Mexican-American War had ceded vast new territories to the United States, and the question of whether these lands would permit or prohibit slavery could no longer be postponed. The Wilmot Proviso, which sought to ban slavery from all territories acquired from Mexico, successfully passed the House of Representatives, but failed to advance in the Senate. The battle lines were being drawn, and the prospect of compromise was diminishing. The Compromise of 1850 represented Henry Clay's final significant endeavor to preserve the Union. California would be admitted as a free state. The territories of Utah and New Mexico would determine the status of slavery within their borders through popular sovereignty. The trade in enslaved people would be prohibited in Washington, D.C., and a more stringent Fugitive Slave Act would compel Northerners to assist in the apprehension and repatriation of escaped slaves. This complex legislative package offered concessions to both factions while failing to truly satisfy either. The Fugitive Slave Act, in particular, proved to be highly provocative in the North. Suddenly, free black Americans could be apprehended on the streets and forcibly returned to slavery with minimal legal recourse. White Northerners, who had previously remained indifferent to the plight of enslaved people, found themselves compelled to participate in the enforcement of this law or face legal repercussions. The legislation transformed every Northern community into a potential theater of conflict between slave catchers and abolitionists. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, brought home the grim realities of slavery to Northern households with an unprecedented emotional impact. The book sold over 300,000 copies within its first year and was subsequently adapted for theatrical performances across the North. Southerners vehemently denounced it as propaganda and falsehoods, yet its influence on Northern public opinion was undeniable. When Stowe met President Lincoln years later, he is reported to have said, "So, you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 irrevocably shattered the Missouri Compromise and unleashed a torrent of violence. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, eager to facilitate the construction of a transcontinental railroad through his home state, proposed the organization of the Kansas and Nebraska territories under the principle of popular sovereignty. This meant that the settlers themselves would decide the question of slavery, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise's prohibition of slavery north of the 36°30 line. The response was immediate and furious. Northern politicians condemned the act as a betrayal of solemn agreements. Southern politicians viewed it as an opportunity to extend slavery into new territories. However, it was within Kansas itself that the repercussions would be most acutely felt. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri, known as border ruffians, flooded across the border to cast their votes in territorial elections. Anti-slavery settlers, many supported by Northern aid societies, established their own communities and prepared to fight for Kansas's future. The outcome was Bleeding Kansas, a grim foreshadowing of the larger conflict that lay ahead. Elections were tainted by fraud and brutality. Two rival governments claimed legitimate authority. Armed groups roamed the territory, destroying homes and murdering opponents. The violence escalated dramatically in May 1856, when pro-slavery forces raided the Free State town of Lawrence, destroying printing presses and setting fire to buildings. 3 days later, a radical abolitionist named John Brown led a midnight assault on pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek. Brown and his followers forcibly removed 5 men from their homes and brutally killed them with broadswords. The Pottawatomie Massacre, as it became known, sent shockwaves throughout the nation and cemented Brown's status as one of the most controversial figures of his time. To abolitionists, he was a righteous warrior battling the sin of slavery. To Southerners, he was a terrorist and a madman. The violence in Kansas mirrored the escalating tensions in Washington. In May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a fiery speech titled #0, wherein he personally assailed several Southern senators, including Andrew Butler of South Carolina. 2 days later, Butler's nephew, Representative Preston Brooks, entered the Senate chamber and physically assaulted Sumner into unconsciousness with a gold-headed cane. Sumner's injuries were so grave that he was unable to return to the Senate for over 3 years, yet Massachusetts kept his seat vacant as a testament to Southern barbarity. The caning of Sumner became a galvanizing slogan for both regions. Northerners were appalled by what they perceived as an assault on freedom of expression and democratic principles. Southerners lauded Brooks as a protector of Southern honor and sent him numerous replacement canes. This incident perfectly encapsulated the deterioration of civil dialogue and the increasing reliance on violence in American politics. The Supreme Court's ruling in the Dred Scott case in 1857 delivered another crippling blow to the anti-slavery movement. Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing for the majority, declared that African Americans could never attain United States citizenship and that Congress lacked the authority to forbid slavery in the territories. The Missouri Compromise was deemed unconstitutional, effectively preventing the federal government from interfering with slavery anywhere in the country. This decision was a legal and political earthquake. Republicans condemned it as a plot to nationalize slavery. Stephen Douglas found himself in an untenable position, defending popular sovereignty when the court had decreed that territorial legislatures had no power to prohibit slavery. Abraham Lincoln, then a relatively obscure lawyer and politician from Illinois, began to emerge as a forceful voice against the ruling and its repercussions. Lincoln's renowned House Divided speech, delivered upon accepting the Republican nomination for Senate in 1858, solidified the growing conviction that the issue of slavery could no longer be circumvented. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," Lincoln proclaimed. "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." The Lincoln-Douglas debates that ensued during the 1858 Senate campaign brought national attention to both men and helped define the parameters of the slavery debate. Douglas championed popular sovereignty, and sought to characterize Lincoln as an extreme abolitionist. Lincoln carefully differentiated his personal disapproval of slavery from his constitutional obligations, yet he clearly articulated his belief that slavery was morally reprehensible and should not be permitted to expand. Although Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debates established him as a national figure and a prominent voice within the Republican Party. His meticulous, well-reasoned arguments against the expansion of slavery, coupled with his evident political adroitness, positioned him as a compelling candidate for higher office. The groundwork was being laid for the 1860 election, which would not only decide the presidency, but also the survival of the Union. The autumn of 1859 brought an event that would propel the nation beyond the point of no return. John Brown, the same individual who had orchestrated the Pottawatomie massacre in Kansas, had spent the intervening years planning something far more ambitious and perilous. He envisioned a slave revolt that would spread like wildfire across the South, freeing millions of enslaved people and dismantling the peculiar institution. Brown's plan was bold in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. He intended to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, arm the local slave population, and establish a stronghold in the Blue Ridge Mountains from which he could launch raids throughout the South. It was the embodiment of Southern nightmares, and its consequences would extend far beyond what even Brown could have anticipated. On the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and 21 followers, including 5 black men and 3 of his sons, crossed the Potomac River and seized the arsenal. They severed telegraph lines, captured several prominent local citizens as hostages, and awaited enslaved people flocking to their cause. However, the uprising Brown anticipated never materialized. Instead, local militia surrounded the arsenal, and federal troops under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee arrived to resolve the standoff. The assault on the engine house, where Brown and his men had taken refuge, was swift and decisive. 10 of Brown's followers were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown himself was wounded and captured, along with several others. The raid lasted less than 36 hours, but its impact would resonate for years. Brown's trial became a national sensation. Lying on a cot in the courtroom, wounded yet unyielding, he transitioned from a failed insurrectionist to a martyr for the abolitionist cause. His final address to the court was a testament to moral conviction. Quote, "The reaction to Brown's raid and subsequent execution revealed the profound divide between the North and South. In the North, church bells tolled on the day of his execution, and he was hailed as a martyr who had sacrificed his life for human freedom. Ralph Waldo Emerson likened him to Jesus Christ, and Henry David Thoreau referred to him as an angel of light. In the South, Brown was seen as the epitome of Northern extremism, proof that abolitionists would stop at nothing to dismantle Southern society. The raid had another crucial effect. It convinced many Southerners that they could no longer rely on the federal government to safeguard their interests. If a small group of abolitionists could seize a federal arsenal and attempt to instigate a slave rebellion, what would happen if the anti-slavery Republican Party gained control of the government? The answer, many Southerners believed, was the annihilation of their way of life. As 1860 commenced, the Democratic Party, which had maintained the Union through decades of compromise, began to splinter along sectional lines. The party's national convention in Charleston, South Carolina, became a battleground between Northern Democrats, led by Stephen Douglas, and Southern Democrats who demanded federal protection for slavery in the territories. When the convention failed to nominate Douglas, Southern delegates departed, and the party bifurcated into Northern and Southern factions. The Republican Party, meanwhile, was gaining momentum and confidence. Established just 6 years prior as an anti-slavery party, it had experienced rapid growth by appealing to Northern voters who opposed the expansion of slavery. The party's platform for 1860 was meticulously crafted to attract a broad coalition: opposition to slavery's expansion, support for a transcontinental railroad, higher tariffs to protect Northern industry, and free land for Western settlers. The Republican convention in Chicago was a boisterous event with multiple candidates vying for the nomination. William Seward of New York was the early favorite, but his reputation as a radical on slavery rendered him vulnerable. Abraham Lincoln, the prairie lawyer from Illinois, emerged as a compromise candidate who could appeal to moderate voters while upholding the party's anti-slavery principles. Lincoln's nomination sent reverberations through the South. Here was a man who had declared that the Union could not endure half slave and half free, who had debated Stephen Douglas on the immorality of slavery, and who represented a party dedicated to slavery's eventual abolition. Southern newspapers decried him as a black Republican who would destroy Southern civilization. Several Southern states began making preparations for secession even before the election took place. The 1860 campaign was unlike any other in American history. 4 candidates competed for the presidency: Lincoln for the Republicans, Douglas for the Northern Democrats, John C. Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and John Bell for the Constitutional Union Party. Lincoln's name did not appear on the ballot in 10 Southern states, a clear indication of the nation's deep division. Lincoln conducted a traditional front porch campaign, receiving visitors at his home in Springfield, Illinois, while his supporters organized torchlight parades and mass rallies across the North. He remained largely silent during the campaign, allowing his previous speeches and the Republican platform to speak for him. His reticence was strategic. Anything he said could be distorted by his opponents to make him appear more radical than he was. The election results were decisive, yet foreboding. Lincoln secured a clear majority in the Electoral College with 180 votes, but he garnered less than 40% of the popular vote and virtually no support in the South. The election had highlighted a nation so fragmented that no candidate could appeal to both regions. The center had failed to hold, and the consequences would prove catastrophic. South Carolina had been preparing for this moment for months. Even before the election results were official, the state legislature convened a secession convention. On December 20th, 1860, delegates meeting in Charleston unanimously voted to sever South Carolina's ties with the United States. The Palmetto State had fired the opening salvo in what would become a war of unparalleled destruction. The secession of South Carolina was followed by a series of similar actions across the Deep South. Mississippi seceded on January 9, 1861, followed by Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By February 1st, 7 states had departed the Union, and delegates converged in Montgomery, Alabama, to establish a new entity, the Confederate States of America. The Confederate Convention acted swiftly to institute a government. They ratified a constitution largely mirroring the U.S. Constitution, but with significant divergences. It explicitly safeguarded slavery, restricted the president to a single 6-year tenure, and granted augmented authority to individual states. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, a West Point alumnus and former U.S. Senator, was appointed president, with Alexander Stephens of Georgia serving as vice president. In his inaugural address, Stephens articulated the Confederacy's core tenets. The new nation, he declared, was founded on the fundamental principle that the Negro is not the equal of the white man, and that slavery, or subordination to the superior race, represents his natural and inherent condition. This statement unequivocally defined the Confederate cause and the central conflict that had fractured the nation. Concurrently, in Washington, the outgoing administration of James Buchanan grappled with the burgeoning crisis. Buchanan, a Pennsylvania Democrat sympathetic to the South, deemed secession unlawful, but maintained that the federal government lacked the authority to thwart it. His inaction permitted the Confederates to seize federal assets across the South, including fortifications, armories, and customs houses. Abraham Lincoln, still president-elect, observed these developments with increasing concern. He had harbored hopes that his election would not precipitate disunion, and maintained a belief in the loyalty of most Southerners to the Union. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, he endeavored to assuage Southern anxieties while affirming his resolve to preserve the Union. Lincoln stated, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. However, he also made it clear that he would not countenance secession. No state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union, he asserted. The Union, he argued, was perpetual, and he would employ all his constitutional powers to maintain it. Lincoln's pronouncements resonated little in the South. The Confederates had progressed beyond the stage where presidential reassurances could induce their return to the Union. They had established their own government, elected their own leader, and were resolute in pursuing their independence. The sole uncertainty remained whether this objective could be achieved peacefully or would necessitate armed conflict. The resolution emerged at a small installation in Charleston Harbor. Fort Sumter, constructed on an artificial islet to safeguard the port, had become a symbol of federal authority within the heart of the Confederacy. Major Robert Anderson, the fort's commander, had relocated his modest garrison from the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie in December, provoking the ire of South Carolinians who perceived it as an act of provocation. The fort's predicament was precarious. Anderson commanded fewer than 80 men and possessed limited provisions, while Confederate forces encircled the harbor. Lincoln confronted an unenviable decision. To resupply the fort risked war, while abandoning it would imply recognition of Confederate independence. He opted for a middle path, announcing his intention to dispatch provisions but no additional troops. Confederate leaders interpreted this as their defining moment. Allowing federal forces to remain in Charleston Harbor would render their claims of independence hollow. On April 11th, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard demanded Anderson's surrender. Upon Anderson's refusal, Beauregard ordered his batteries to open fire. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, a Confederate mortar shell traced an arc through the darkness and detonated above Fort Sumter. The American Civil War had commenced. For 34 hours, Confederate artillery bombarded the fort, while Anderson's men returned fire as best they could. Miraculously, no fatalities occurred during the shelling, but the fort's situation was hopeless. On April 13th, Anderson surrendered, and the stars and stripes were lowered over Fort Sumter for the first time since the Revolution. The assault on Fort Sumter ignited a fervent response in the North. Lincoln promptly summoned 75,000 volunteers to quell the rebellion, and men flocked to enlist in numbers that surpassed the expectations of even the most optimistic officials. The war, which many had hoped to avert, was now unavoidable, and both sides prepared for what they anticipated would be a brief, decisive engagement. However, the attack on Sumter also had another consequence. It propelled 4 additional states into the Confederacy. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas had initially rejected secession. Yet, Lincoln's call for troops to coerce their sister states proved intolerable. By June, 11 states had joined the Confederacy, and the battle lines were established. The conflict that originated at Fort Sumter would endure for 4 years and claim over 600,000 lives. It would transform the United States from a loose confederation of states into a modern nation, abolish slavery permanently, and solidify the federal government's supremacy over the states. But in April 1861, none of this was foreseeable. Americans on both sides believed they were contending for their most cherished principles and were prepared to pay any price for victory. The spring of 1861 found America dramatically shifted overnight from a peaceful nation to one poised for warfare. In the North, the attack on Fort Sumter had generated a surge of patriotic fervor not witnessed since the Revolution. Young men queued at recruitment stations. Bands played martial music in town squares, and women organized sewing circles to fashion uniforms for the volunteers. The Union cause was perceived as just, and victory as inevitable. Yet, beneath the surface enthusiasm lay concerning realities. The United States Army comprised fewer than 16,000 men, largely dispersed across the western frontier engaged in combat with Native Americans. The Navy was diminutive, and many of its officers were Southerners who had relinquished their commissions. The government lacked preparedness for large-scale warfare, a system for raising substantial armies, and experience in managing a conflict of the magnitude that was imminent. Abraham Lincoln, propelled into the presidency during America's most significant crisis, had never commanded anything larger than a company of soldiers. His military experience was confined to a brief involvement in the Black Hawk War 30 years prior, during which he saw no combat, and later quipped that his only battles were with mosquitoes. Nonetheless, this prairie lawyer would need to master the art of war while prosecuting it, making life-and-death decisions that would impact millions. The president's initial challenge was retaining the border states within the Union. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware all possessed substantial pro-Confederate populations, and their secession would have been catastrophic. Maryland's departure would have placed Washington, D.C. surrounded by hostile territory. Kentucky controlled the Ohio River and a significant portion of the Mississippi. Missouri commanded the gateway to the West. Lincoln would need to employ a combination of political acumen, military might, and constitutional adaptability to ensure these states' allegiance. In Maryland, pro-Confederate mobs assaulted Union troops passing through Baltimore en route to defend Washington. Lincoln responded by suspending the writ of habeas corpus and arresting individuals suspected of secessionist leanings, including members of the state legislature. When Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that only Congress possessed the authority to suspend habeas corpus, Lincoln disregarded him. The Constitution, Lincoln contended, was not a pact for self-destruction, and extraordinary circumstances necessitated extraordinary measures. Kentucky presented a different challenge. The state declared neutrality, hoping to entirely avoid the conflict. Both Union and Confederate forces initially respected this neutrality, but it could not endure. When Confederate forces occupied Columbus, Kentucky, in September 1861, Union General Ulysses S. Grant promptly seized Paducah and Cairo, effectively ending Kentucky's neutrality. The state remained in the Union, although thousands of its sons would fight for the Confederacy. Missouri plunged into a brutal civil war within the Civil War. The pro-Union governor, Nathaniel Lyon, engaged in conflict with pro-Confederate state militias, resulting in battles at Wilson's Creek and Lexington. Guerrilla warfare erupted throughout the state, with bands of Confederate bushwhackers and Union jayhawkers, terrorizing civilians and torching towns. The violence in Missouri would persist throughout the war and beyond, leaving deep scars that would take generations to heal. While Lincoln struggled to maintain the Union, Jefferson Davis faced his own challenges in Richmond, the new Confederate capital. The Confederacy had been formed hastily, and its government was still coalescing. Davis, a West Point graduate and former Secretary of War, brought military experience to the presidency. However, he also possessed a difficult temperament and a propensity for micromanagement that would create difficulties throughout the war. The Confederate Constitution vested greater authority in individual states than the U.S. Constitution, reflecting Southern convictions regarding states' rights. Yet, this decentralization proved detrimental during wartime when swift decisions and unified action were paramount. Georgia's governor, Joseph Brown, would spend much of the war in dispute with Davis over conscription and other federal policies. South Carolina's governor would refuse to permit his state's troops to serve outside South Carolina. The Confederacy's adherence to states' rights undermined its capacity to wage war effectively. Both sides confronted the immense task of assembling armies from scratch. The Union possessed significant advantages in population, industry, and resources. However, these assets required mobilization and organization. The North's population of 22 million significantly outnumbered the South's 9 million, with nearly 4 million of those in the South being enslaved and thus unable to be armed. Northern factories were capable of producing weapons, uniforms, and equipment, whereas the South had to depend on imports or capture Union supplies. The railroad network presented a comparable disparity. The North possessed over 20,000 miles of track connecting its cities and facilitating the movement of troops and supplies. The South, by contrast, had only 9,000 miles of track, much of it in disrepair and utilizing different gauges, which hindered through traffic. The North's railroad system would prove instrumental to its triumph, enabling swift troop movements and sustained supply lines across vast distances. However, the South also possessed advantages. It was engaged in a defensive conflict on familiar terrain, with shorter supply lines and the backing of the local populace. Southern men had a robust military tradition and were proficient with horses and firearms. Numerous highly capable officers, including Robert E. Lee, Albert Sidney Johnston, and Joseph E. Johnston, had relinquished their commissions to join the Confederacy. The initial major engagement of the war transpired sooner than anticipated. Public clamor in the North demanded action, with newspapers urging, "On to Richmond." Lincoln's commanding general, Winfield Scott, favored a more deliberate strategy involving blockading southern ports and securing control of the Mississippi River, but political pressure compelled him to sanction an advance on the Confederate capital. General Irvin McDowell led 35,000 Union troops southward from Washington towards the Confederate Army amassed near Manassas Junction, Virginia. The Confederates, under General P.G.T. Beauregard, numbered approximately 20,000 men, but they anticipated reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley, led by General Joseph E. Johnston. The stage was thus set for the inaugural major battle of the Civil War. On July 21, 1861, the two armies engaged along Bull Run Creek in what became known as the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, to the Confederates. Civilians from Washington, including congressmen and their families, journeyed by carriage to witness the battle, expecting a swift Union victory to quell the rebellion. The engagement commenced favorably for the Union. McDowell's flanking maneuver caught the Confederates off guard, and for several hours it appeared the Union would prevail. However, Confederate reinforcements arrived via railroad, and a Virginia brigade under Colonel Thomas J. Jackson stood firm against repeated Union assaults. "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall," exclaimed General Barnard B., bestowing upon Jackson the moniker that would cement his fame. As the day progressed, the tide turned against the Union. Fresh Confederate troops launched a counterattack that shattered the Union lines. What had been an orderly withdrawal rapidly devolved into a rout, with Union soldiers streaming back towards Washington in a state of panic. The civilians who had come to observe the battle found themselves swept up in the retreat, their carriages obstructing the roads and exacerbating the chaos. The defeat at Bull Run delivered a sobering shock to the North. The war would not conclude within 90 days, as many had predicted. The Confederate Army was not a disorganized rabble, but a formidable fighting force. Lincoln recognized the necessity for a larger army, more capable generals, and a long-term strategy for victory. The President turned to General George B. McClellan, a young officer who had secured minor victories in Western Virginia. McClellan was an exceptional organizer and trainer of troops, and he promptly set about transforming the disorganized volunteer force around Washington into a genuine army. He subjected them to rigorous drills, enhanced their equipment and provisions, and instilled discipline and pride. The Army of the Potomac, as it came to be known, would evolve into one of the most distinguished fighting forces in American history. Yet, McClellan harbored a critical flaw. He was excessively cautious and consistently overestimated the enemy's strength. He believed he faced twice the number of Confederates as were actually present, and was hesitant to attack unless possessing overwhelming superiority. This prudence would frustrate Lincoln and prolong the war. Conversely, it also shielded the Union from potentially catastrophic defeats in the early stages of the conflict. While McClellan trained his army, the war expanded to other theaters. In the West, Union forces under General Nathaniel Lyon were defeated at Wilson's Creek in Missouri, and Lyon was killed in the engagement. Confederate forces invaded Kentucky, posing a threat to bring that vital state into the rebellion. Naval engagements occurred along the coast as the Union endeavored to implement its blockade of southern ports. The blockade, a component of General Scott's Anaconda Plan, was designed to cripple the Confederacy economically by severing its trade with Europe. The South relied on cotton exports to finance its war effort and needed to import weaponry, ammunition, and other essential supplies. By sealing off southern ports, the Union aimed to gradually suffocate the rebellion. However, the blockade faced considerable obstacles. The southern coastline spanned 3,500 miles, encompassing numerous ports and inlets. At the war's outset, the Union Navy had only 42 commissioned ships, many of which were outdated sailing vessels. Establishing an effective blockade necessitated a substantial expansion of the Navy and the development of new technologies. The initial significant success was achieved at Hatteras Inlet in North Carolina, where a joint Army-Navy expedition captured 2 Confederate forts in August 1861. This victory provided the Union with a foothold on the southern coast and demonstrated the efficacy of combined operations. Subsequent similar expeditions would gradually tighten the noose around the Confederacy. The war also acquired an international dimension as both sides sought foreign recognition and support. The Confederacy hoped that Europe's reliance on southern cotton would compel Britain and France to intervene on its behalf. The Union worked to prevent foreign recognition of the Confederacy and to maintain the neutrality of European powers. The crisis reached its apex in November 1861 with the Trent Affair. A Union warship intercepted the British mail steamer Trent and apprehended 2 Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell, who were en route to Europe to solicit recognition for the Confederacy. The British government reacted with outrage to this infringement of neutral rights, demanding the release of the diplomats and an apology. For several weeks, war between the United States and Britain seemed plausible. The British dispatched troops to Canada and prepared their fleet for action. However, cooler heads prevailed, and Lincoln's administration consented to release the diplomats and apologize for the incident. "One war at a time," Lincoln reportedly stated, acknowledging that the Union could not afford to engage in conflict with both the Confederacy and the British Empire. As 1861 drew to a close, both sides braced themselves for what was clearly shaping up to be a protracted and bloody conflict. The initial enthusiasm for war had yielded to a grim resolve to see it through to the end. Families were already mourning their deceased, and the economic toll of the war was escalating. Yet, there was no turning back. The die was cast, and the nation's destiny would be determined on the battlefields of the ensuing years. The winter of 1861-1862 served as a period of preparation and strategic planning. Both armies utilized the lull in hostilities to train recruits, amass supplies, and formulate their upcoming strategies. In Washington, Lincoln grappled with the immense responsibilities of wartime leadership, contending with demanding generals, fractious politicians, and a public eager for swift resolutions. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis faced comparable challenges, exacerbated by the Confederacy's fragile central government and the imperative to forge a nation while simultaneously waging war. The stage was set for the campaigns of 1862, which would witness an expansion in the war's scope and intensity. New technologies would be tested, novel strategies implemented, and new heroes would emerge. The American Civil War was poised to enter its most devastating phase, indelibly altering the nation. The year 1862 commenced with both armies ready for action, following months of preparation and training. The Union had leveraged the winter to bolster its forces and devise a comprehensive strategy for victory. The Confederacy, meanwhile, had reinforced its defenses and prepared for what its leaders understood would be a desperate struggle for survival. In the Western theater, a relatively unknown Union general named Ulysses S. Grant was on the cusp of etching his name in history. Grant had encountered difficulties in civilian life after graduating from West Point, experiencing failures in farming and business before the war rescued him from obscurity. However, he possessed qualities that would distinguish him as one of the preeminent military commanders in American history: determination, strategic foresight, and an understanding that war fundamentally entails crushing the enemy's will to fight. Grant's initial significant success occurred at Fort Henry on the Tennessee River in February 1862. The fort, poorly situated, quickly capitulated to Union gunboats, thereby opening the Tennessee River to Union navigation. More crucially, It provided Grant the opportunity to attack Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, which controlled access to Nashville, the Confederate capital of Tennessee. The siege of Fort Donelson became Grant's inaugural true test as a commander. The Confederate garrison, commanded by Grant's former West Point associate, Simon Bolivar Buckner, was trapped and facing inevitable defeat. When Buckner sought terms, Grant's response became legendary. "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." The fall of Fort Donelson constituted a devastating blow to the Confederacy. Nashville surrendered without a fight, and Confederate forces were compelled to retreat across Tennessee. Grant instantly became a national hero, earning the moniker Unconditional Surrender Grant. More crucially, the victory paved the way for Union forces to advance into the core of the Confederate territory. However, Grant's most significant challenge was yet to emerge. In April 1862, Confederate troops under the command of Albert Sidney Johnston initiated a surprise assault on Grant's army near Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, close to a small chapel named Shiloh. This attack caught the Union forces completely unprepared, and for a period it appeared the Confederates might achieve a decisive triumph. The Battle of Shiloh was unlike anything Americans had previously witnessed. The combat was fierce and chaotic, with units losing their bearings in the dense woods and inadvertently engaging friendly fire. General Johnston, one of the Confederacy's most promising leaders, perished early in the engagement, succumbing to blood loss from a leg wound that might have been survivable with prompt medical care. Grant's army was forced back towards the Tennessee River, and many of his officers advocated for a retreat. Nevertheless, Grant remained resolute. "Retreat?" he is reported to have said. "No, I intended to attack at dawn and defeat them." With reinforcements from General Don Carlos Buell's army arriving overnight, Grant launched a counteroffensive the following morning, compelling the Confederates to withdraw from the battlefield. The casualties at Shiloh were staggering, exceeding 13,000 for the Union and nearly 11,000 for the Confederacy. It marked the most devastating battle in American history up to that point, and offered both sides a preview of the immense bloodshed that lay ahead. Grant faced criticism for being surprised, but Lincoln stood by him, famously remarking, quote, "While Grant secured victories in the West, the situation in the East remained a source of frustration for the Union. General McClellan had devoted months to training and organizing the Army of the Potomac, but seemed hesitant to deploy it. Lincoln grew increasingly exasperated with McClellan's delays and justifications, famously writing, 'If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time.' Finally, in March 1862, McClellan initiated his Peninsula Campaign, transporting his army by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and advancing towards Richmond from the southeast. The strategy was theoretically sound, but McClellan's execution was hampered by his characteristic excessive caution and a tendency to overestimate enemy strength. The Peninsula Campaign commenced promisingly, with Union forces advancing to within sight of Richmond's church steeples. However, McClellan hesitated to deliver the decisive blow, convinced he was outnumbered by Confederate forces that were, in reality, smaller than his own. This indecision provided the Confederates with time to fortify their defenses and summon reinforcements. The Confederate defense of Richmond was complicated by a change in command. General Joseph E. Johnston, who had been leading Confederate forces on the peninsula, sustained wounds at the Battle of Seven Pines in late May. Jefferson Davis replaced him with Robert E. Lee, a decision that would prove to be one of the most pivotal of the war. Lee was 55 years old and had spent the majority of his career as an engineer and staff officer. He had opposed secession and had been offered command of Union forces at the war's outset, but his loyalty to Virginia prompted him to resign from the U.S. Army and join the Confederacy. Many questioned Davis's selection, as Lee had not distinguished himself in his previous commands in Western Virginia and South Carolina. Yet, Lee would emerge as a military genius, arguably the finest tactical commander in American history. He recognized that the Confederacy could not prevail in a war of attrition against the more populous and industrialized North. Instead, he would need to take risks, employ bold tactics, and ideally achieve decisive victories that would undermine Northern morale and elicit foreign intervention. Lee's initial major operation was the 7 Days Battles, a series of assaults on McClellan's army in late June 1862. The battles incurred heavy losses for both sides, but Lee accomplished his strategic goal of forcing McClellan to withdraw from Richmond. The Peninsula Campaign, which had held such great promise, concluded in failure for the Union. McClellan's retreat was a profound disappointment to Lincoln and the Northern public. The general, once hailed as the young Napoleon, had failed to capture Richmond despite possessing every advantage. Lincoln began to lose faith in McClellan. Although he would grant him one more opportunity to prove himself, the failure of the Peninsula Campaign had broader implications for Union strategy. It became evident that the war would not be concluded swiftly or easily, and that the Union would need to marshal all its resources for an extended conflict. Congress enacted the first conscription law in American history. Despite allowing wealthy individuals to hire substitutes or pay a $300 commutation fee, it generated complaints that it was a conflict benefiting the rich at the expense of the poor. The war was also beginning to reshape American society in fundamental ways. The demands of the conflict were dismantling traditional barriers and creating new opportunities for previously marginalized groups. Women assumed new roles as nurses, factory workers, and even spies. The renowned nurse Clara Barton would later establish the American Red Cross, drawing upon her experiences during the Civil War. African Americans, both free and enslaved, viewed the war as a chance to advance the cause of freedom. Thousands of enslaved people escaped to Union lines, where they were classified as contraband and assigned to support the war effort. Free black men in the North petitioned for the right to enlist in the army, though this would not be permitted until later in the war. The issue of slavery was increasingly becoming central to the war's objectives. Radical Republicans in Congress advocated for emancipation, asserting that slavery was the fundamental cause of the rebellion and must be eradicated to ensure lasting peace. Lincoln adopted a more cautious approach, concerned that premature action on slavery might alienate the border states, driving them into the Confederacy and antagonize conservative Northern Democrats. However, circumstances were compelling Lincoln to act. The war was enduring longer and proving more costly than anyone had anticipated. If the Union expected its citizens to endure such immense sacrifices, it required a cause more inspiring than simply preserving the existing order. Emancipation would imbue the war with a moral dimension, galvanizing Northern support and deterring European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. The military situation also favored emancipation. Enslaved people constituted a vital resource for the Confederacy, laboring in fields and factories while white men served in the army. If the Union could leverage this resource against the Confederacy by promising freedom to enslaved individuals, it would deliver a devastating blow to the Southern war effort. Lincoln began drafting an Emancipation Proclamation in the summer of 1862, but his advisors persuaded him to await a military victory before announcing it. A proclamation issued after a defeat would appear as an act of desperation, whereas one presented after a victory would signify a position of strength. The opportunity presented itself sooner than anticipated. Buoyed by his success in defending Richmond, Lee resolved to take the war northward. In September 1862, he led his army across the Potomac River into Maryland, hoping to secure a decisive victory on Northern soil that would garner European recognition and potentially conclude the war. Lee's invasion of Maryland was a calculated risk. His army was fatigued and poorly supplied after months of campaigning, with many soldiers marching barefoot and in rags. Nevertheless, Lee believed a victory in Maryland could fundamentally alter the war's trajectory. European powers were observing closely, and a Confederate triumph on Northern territory might persuade them to acknowledge Southern independence. The campaign began favorably for Lee. His army crossed into Maryland unopposed, and he issued a proclamation urging Marylanders to join the Confederate cause. However, Lee's plans were disrupted when a copy of his orders, wrapped around 3 cigars, was discovered by Union soldiers at an abandoned Confederate campsite. The lost orders revealed that Lee had divided his army, dispatching a portion to capture the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, while the remainder continued north. McClellan, for once, acted swiftly to capitalize on this intelligence, advancing to engage Lee's separated forces. The two armies clashed at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, on September 17, 1862. The Battle of Antietam would become the single bloodiest day in American history, with over 23,000 casualties. The fighting was savage and chaotic, with both sides launching desperate assaults and counterattacks across the undulating Maryland landscape. The battle commenced at dawn with a Union assault on the Confederate left flank near Dunker Church. The combat ebbed and flowed through the cornfields, with entire regiments being decimated in minutes. The 1st Texas Infantry entered the fray with 226 men and emerged with only 40. The corn was cut down as if by a giant scythe, and the field was strewn with bodies. The center of the Confederate line occupied a sunken road that came to be known as Bloody Lane after Union forces finally broke through and filled it with Confederate dead. The Confederate right flank was secured at Antietam Creek, where a narrow stone bridge became the target of repeated Union attacks. The bridge, later renamed the Antietam Creek Bridge in honor of the battle, was finally seized after hours of intense fighting. Despite sustaining immense losses, Lee's army maintained its position throughout the day. However, the Confederate situation was precarious, with the armies positioned near the Potomac River and no room for retreat. That night, Lee made the difficult decision to withdraw back into Virginia, concluding the Maryland campaign. Antietam represented a strategic victory for the Union. Despite the Confederacy's inability to pursue and destroy Lee's retreating forces, the Northern invasion had been repelled. European acknowledgement of the Confederacy was indefinitely delayed, and Lincoln finally secured the victory necessary to enact the Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln declared that all enslaved individuals in territories still in rebellion, as of January 1, 1863, would gain their freedom permanently. This proclamation was carefully formulated to avoid alienating the border states, applying exclusively to areas under Confederate control. Nevertheless, its symbolic significance was immense, transforming the war from a struggle for union into a crusade for human liberty. The reception of the Emancipation Proclamation was varied. Abolitionists hailed it as a significant advancement, while conservatives denounced it as unconstitutional and radical. In the South, it was condemned as an incitement to slave insurrection and evidence of Northern extremism. However, the proclamation achieved its primary objectives. It bolstered Northern morale, deterred European interference, and initiated the process of turning the war into a moral crusade. Furthermore, the proclamation paved the way for African American military participation. Free black men in the North had sought to enlist since the war's outset but were declined. With emancipation now official policy, the Union commenced recruiting black soldiers in earnest. By the war's conclusion, nearly 200,000 African Americans had served in the Union Army and Navy, playing a vital role in their own liberation. The year 1862 concluded with mixed outcomes for both sides. The Union achieved substantial successes in the West, capturing towns such as New Orleans and Memphis, and gaining control of much of Tennessee. However, in the East, the army of the PTOAC suffered a catastrophic defeat at Fredericksburg in December. There, Ambrose Burnside, who had succeeded McClellan, launched futile frontal assaults against formidable Confederate defenses. The Battle of Fredericksburg was a massacre, resulting in over 12,000 Union casualties compared to fewer than 5,000 Confederate. The defeat was so decisive that Confederate General James Longstreet later remarked, "The Federals had been throwing men away so recklessly that I began to believe they had an unlimited supply." This battle shattered Burnside's reputation and left the army of the Potomac demoralized and without effective leadership. As 1863 commenced, both sides braced for what they understood would be the war's pivotal year. The Union possessed the resources and manpower to prevail, but required improved leadership and a clearer strategic direction. The Confederacy faced a shortage of men and supplies, but retained superior generals and the advantage of defending its own territory. The stage was set for the campaigns that would ultimately decide the nation's destiny. The winter of 1862-1863 marked a period of crisis and introspection for the Union. The army of the PTOAC, battered and dispirited after the Fredericksburg disaster, took up winter quarters across the Rapidan River from Lee's Confederates. Desertions became rampant, with some regiments losing up to half their strength as soldiers simply abandoned the conflict. Abraham Lincoln faced the most challenging period of his presidency. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued, but its effects were not yet fully realized. Democrats had made significant gains in midterm elections, campaigning on a platform of peace and compromise. Radical Republicans criticized Lincoln for insufficiently aggressive prosecution of the war, while conservative Democrats accused him of transforming the conflict into an unending abolitionist crusade. The president's personal life was also turbulent. His wife, Mary, struggled with mental illness, exacerbated by the death of their son Willie from typhoid fever in February 1862. Lincoln himself exhibited the strain of command, his face growing gaunter and more lined with each passing month. Visitors to the White House were struck by his appearance, describing him as bearing the weight of the world upon his shoulders. However, Lincoln's greatest challenge lay in finding generals capable of matching Robert E. Lee's tactical brilliance. Ambrose Burnside, the latest in a succession of unsuccessful commanders of the Army of the PTOAC, had demonstrated his incompetence at Fredericksburg. His successor, Joseph Hooker, a hard-drinking, boastful general known as "Zero," pledged to restore the Army's morale and achieve decisive victories. Hooker did succeed in improving the Army's condition during the winter months. He reformed the supply system, granted furloughs to deserving soldiers, and reorganized the cavalry into an effective fighting force. By spring, the Army of the PTOAC was larger and better equipped than ever before, with over 130,000 men ready for action. Hooker's plan for the spring campaign was ambitious and well-conceived. He intended to leave a third of his army to hold Lee's forces at Fredericksburg, while leading the remainder on a wide flanking maneuver through the wilderness of Spotsylvania. This would compel Lee to abandon his strong defensive positions and engage on ground of Hooker's choosing. It was precisely the kind of bold, aggressive strategy Lincoln had advocated. The campaign began promisingly in late April 1863. Hooker's flanking force crossed the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers unopposed and concentrated near a tavern crossroads known as Chancellorsville. Lee was caught by surprise by the movement and appeared to be in an untenable position, threatened from two directions by superior forces. However, Lee's response to the crisis exemplified why he was regarded as one of history's preeminent military commanders. Instead of retreating or attempting to defend comprehensively, he made the audacious decision to divide his already outnumbered army. Leaving a small contingent to monitor the Union troops at Fredericksburg, he marched the majority of his army west to confront Hooker at Chancellorsville. The Battle of Chancellorsville commenced on May 1, 1863, when Lee's vanguard encountered Hooker's forces emerging from the wilderness. To everyone's astonishment, Hooker ordered his men to withdraw into defensive positions, ceding the initiative to Lee. Fighting Joe had lost his nerve at the critical juncture, a fact Lee swiftly exploited. That evening, Lee made an even bolder decision. Based on intelligence from local guides, he learned that the Union right flank was exposed and vulnerable. He resolved to divide his army again, dispatching Stonewall Jackson with 26,000 men on a 12-mile march around the Union flank, while he engaged Hooker with the remaining 17,000. Jackson's flank march on May 2nd stands as one of military history's most audacious maneuvers. For hours, his column wound its way through the dense woods of the wilderness, utilizing obscure paths and logging roads. Union scouts observed elements of the column and reported the activity to Hooker, but the Union commander presumed Lee was retreating and made no attempt to intervene. Late in the afternoon, Jackson's troops emerged from the woods and formed for an assault. The Union 11th Corps, largely composed of German immigrants, was completely unprepared for the impending attack. Many soldiers were engaged in cooking or playing cards when the Confederate battle cry echoed through the forest, and thousands of gray-clad soldiers burst from the trees. The attack was devastating. The entire 11th Corps collapsed in panic, retreating through the woods in complete disarray. Jackson's men pursued relentlessly, overwhelming the Union lines and threatening to encircle Hooker's entire army. For a fleeting period, it appeared that Lee might achieve the war's most resounding victory. However, tragedy befell the Confederate cause at the apex of its triumph. Jackson, riding ahead in the darkness to scout Union positions, was accidentally shot by his own men, who mistook his party for Union cavalry. The wounds sustained were severe, necessitating the amputation of his left arm, and Jackson succumbed to pneumonia 8 days later. The loss of Stonewall Jackson was a grievous blow to the Confederacy. Lee referred to him as his right arm, and his death deprived the Confederate Army of its most aggressive and capable corps commander. "I have lost my right arm," Lee is reported to have said upon learning of Jackson's death. Jackson, in turn, reputedly responded, Quote 2, referring to his amputated limb. Despite Jackson's wounding, the Battle of Chancellorsville persisted for 2 more days. Lee pressed his attacks against Hooker's demoralized forces while simultaneously addressing a Union assault on his rear guard at Fredericksburg. It was a masterclass in tactical coordination, with Lee managing to defeat forces twice the size of his own army. Hooker, utterly defeated and possibly suffering from a concussion after a Confederate shell struck his headquarters, ordered a retreat across the Rappahannock. The Army of the Potomac endured another ignominious defeat, sustaining over 17,000 casualties while inflicting only 13,000 on Lee's army. It was Lee's greatest victory, but it came at a profound cost in irreplaceable officers and men. The victory at Chancellorsville convinced Lee that the moment was opportune for another invasion of the North. The Army of Northern Virginia was at its zenith, having just vanquished a significantly larger Union force. Northern morale was at a low ebb, and calls for peace negotiations were escalating. A decisive victory on Northern soil might secure European recognition, bolster Northern Democratic support for peace, and potentially conclude the war on Confederate terms. Lee's second invasion of the North commenced in June 1863, with his army advancing through the Shenandoah Valley into Maryland and Pennsylvania. The Confederate advance generated widespread panic in the North, prompting the mobilization of militia units and leading government officials to prepare for the evacuation of Washington and Harrisburg. For the first time since the Revolution, a foreign army was marching through Pennsylvania. The invasion also necessitated another change in command for the Army of the Potomac. Hooker, still smarting from his defeat at Chancellorsville, clashed with the War Department regarding the garrison at Harper's Ferry and offered his resignation. To his surprise, Lincoln accepted it, appointing General George Gordon Meade, a capable but unremarkable corps commander, to replace him. Meade had a mere 3 days to assume command of the army and pursue Lee into Pennsylvania. This was a formidable undertaking, made more challenging by the fact that neither army had precise knowledge of the other's location. Lee's cavalry, led by J.B. Stuart, had embarked on a raid around the Union Army and lost communication, leaving Lee blind to Union movements. The two armies inadvertently encountered each other in the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg on July 1, 1863. Neither commander had planned to engage there, but the collision of advance units rapidly escalated into a major engagement. The town's strategic importance as an intersection of several roads prompted both sides to rush reinforcements to the scene. The initial day of fighting favored the Confederates. They pushed Union forces through the town and onto elevated ground south of Gettysburg, including Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. However, Lee's subordinates failed to capitalize on their advantage, enabling Union forces to establish strong defensive positions along what became known as the Fishhook Line. That evening, both armies concentrated their troops for what was anticipated to be a decisive battle. Lee commanded approximately 75,000 men, while Meade led around 90,000. The Union held a strong position, occupying high ground with good fields of fire. Nevertheless, Lee remained confident that his veteran troops could breach the Union line at any point he chose to attack. The second day of the battle, July 2nd, saw Lee attempt to envelop both flanks of the Union line. James Longstreet's corps assaulted the Union left at Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den, while Richard Ewell's corps attacked the Union right on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. The fighting was exceptionally fierce, resulting in immense casualties for both sides, yet the Union line held. The hero of Little Round Top was Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Infantry. When his regiment exhausted its ammunition during repeated Confederate assaults, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge that repelled the Confederate attack and secured the Union left flank. His actions merited him the Medal of Honor and established him as one of the war's most celebrated heroes. Lee's assaults on the second day came close to succeeding, but ultimately failed. A less determined general might have retreated, but Lee was convinced that one more offensive would break the Union line. He resolved to attack the center of the Union position on Cemetery Ridge, believing Meade had weakened it to reinforce his flanks. The third day at Gettysburg, July 3rd, commenced with a massive artillery bombardment intended to weaken the Union center. For 2 hours, 150 Confederate cannons pounded the Union positions on Cemetery Ridge in what was arguably the largest artillery barrage witnessed in North America. The Union artillery responded, and the thunder of the cannonade was audible 25 miles away. As the artillery fire subsided, 15,000 Confederate infantrymen under General George Pickett began their advance across the open fields toward Cemetery Ridge. It was a magnificent and terrifying spectacle. Long lines of gray-clad soldiers marching in precise formation toward the Union positions, their battle flags fluttering, their officers mounted and conspicuous. However, Pickett's charge, as it became known, was doomed from the outset. Union artillery had not been silenced, and as the Confederate lines advanced, they were decimated by canister and grape shot. Union infantry, sheltered behind stone walls and earthworks, unleashed devastating volleys into the advancing ranks. Only a few hundred Confederates reached the Union line, and they were swiftly overcome. The repulse of Pickett's charge represented the Confederacy's high water mark. Lee's army had sustained over 28,000 casualties in 3 days of fighting, losses from which it could not recover. The Army of Northern Virginia would never again possess the strength to invade the North or achieve a decisive victory. The war had reached its turning point. Lee accepted full responsibility for the defeat, telling his men, "It is all my fault." He offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, but the Confederate president declined to accept it. There was no one else capable of commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, and Davis understood that Lee's leadership was vital to the Confederate cause, even in defeat. Meade's failure to pursue and destroy Lee's retreating army deeply frustrated Lincoln. The president believed the war could have been concluded at Gettysburg had Meade acted more aggressively. "We had them within our grasp," Lincoln stated. "We had only to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours." However, Meade, like many Union generals before him, was content with a defensive victory and let the opportunity pass. The Battle of Gettysburg was not the only Union triumph in July 1863. On July 4th, the same day Lee began his withdrawal from Pennsylvania, Ulysses S. Grant finally captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, after a siege lasting 47 days. The fall of Vicksburg granted the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and isolating Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the South. The siege of Vicksburg was a masterclass in strategy and logistics. Grant had attempted several approaches to the city, which was situated on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River and considered impregnable. Ultimately, he marched his army down the west bank of the river, crossed below the city, and approached Vicksburg from the rear, severing its supply lines and reinforcements. The siege proved a nightmare for the civilians trapped in Vicksburg. Confederate and Union artillery bombarded the city day and night, forcing residents to seek refuge in caves dug into the hillsides. Food became scarce, and people resorted to eating rats, mules, and shoe leather. By the time the city surrendered, the garrison was starving, and the civilian population was on the brink of collapse. Grant's victory at Vicksburg elevated him to the status of the most successful Union general and brought him to Lincoln's attention as a potential commander of all Union armies. Unlike the cautious generals commanding in the East, Grant recognized that the war's objective was to dismantle the enemy's capacity to fight, not merely to win battles. He was willing to sustain heavy casualties if it meant achieving decisive outcomes. The combined victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg signaled the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. The South had forfeited its best chance for military victory in the war, and the Union was finally beginning to leverage its superior resources effectively. Nevertheless, the war was far from over, and the Confederacy would continue to fight with desperate courage for nearly 2 more years. The summer of 1863 also witnessed the first large-scale deployment of African American troops in combat. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the initial black regiments recruited in the North, spearheaded an assault on Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor on July 18th. The attack was unsuccessful, and the regiment suffered significant casualties, including its white colonel, Robert Gould Shaw. However, the bravery exhibited by the 54th Massachusetts played a crucial role in shifting Northern attitudes toward black soldiers. Frederick Douglass had contended that military service would be paramount to achieving full citizenship for African Americans, and the performance of black troops in battle validated his assertion. By the war's conclusion, black soldiers constituted 10% of the Union Army, and were instrumental in their own liberation. The year 1863 concluded with mixed results for both sides. While the Union secured decisive victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, it also experienced defeats at Chickamauga and Chancellorsville. The Confederacy was clearly on the defensive but still fielded capable armies and determined leaders. The war would persist, yet the momentum had unequivocally shifted in favor of the Union. As 1864 commenced, Lincoln faced a presidential election that would determine not only his political future, but also the destiny of the Union cause. A loss might lead to his successor negotiating a peace that would preserve the Confederacy's independence and maintain slavery. Everything hinged on the military campaigns of the ensuing year and the Union's capacity to bring the war to a successful resolution. The dawn of 1864 found Abraham Lincoln confronting the most significant challenge of his presidency. The war had dragged on for nearly 3 years, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives and billions of dollars. Northern morale was flagging, and the impending presidential election posed a potential disaster for the Republican Party and the Union cause. Lincoln understood that decisive military victories were essential to sustain public support for the war. The president's search for a general capable of matching Robert E. Lee's tactical brilliance finally ended with Ulysses S. Grant. The victor of Vicksburg had demonstrated his comprehension of modern warfare. It was insufficient to win battles. One had to cripple the enemy's ability to continue fighting. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to General-in-Chief of all Union armies, granting him unprecedented authority to coordinate the war effort. Grant's strategy for 1864 was elegantly straightforward. Apply pressure simultaneously across multiple fronts, preventing Confederate forces from redeploying to counter threats. While he accompanied the Army of the Potomac in its advance toward Richmond, William Tecumseh Sherman would march from Tennessee toward Atlanta. Nathaniel Banks would advance up the Red River in Louisiana, and Benjamin Butler would threaten Richmond from the south via the James River. This plan represented a fundamental alteration in Union strategy. Prior campaigns had been fragmented endeavors, with armies operating in isolation and often at odds with one another. Grant recognized that the Union's paramount advantage lay in its numerical superiority. This strength, however, could only be effectively leveraged through synchronized operations. The Confederacy would be compelled to engage on multiple fronts simultaneously, thus straining its limited resources to their absolute limit. Grant's initial challenge arose in the dense terrain of Spotsylvania County, Virginia, where Lee had previously bested Hooker. The Battle of the Wilderness, fought on May 5th and 6th, 1864, devolved into a chaotic and brutal engagement within thick woodlands that diminished the Union's advantages in artillery and troop numbers. Combatants fought at close quarters, frequently unable to discern their adversaries through the dense undergrowth. While the battle represented a tactical success for Lee, who inflicted greater losses on Grant than he sustained, Grant's reaction to the setback illuminated his distinction from preceding Union generals. Rather than withdrawing across the Rappahannock, as his predecessors had done, Grant directed his forces southward, aiming to position himself between Lee and Richmond. The soldiers of the Army of the PTOS, having grown accustomed to retreating after every confrontation with Lee, were astonished to find themselves advancing. Cheers erupted throughout the column as word spread that unconditional surrender Grant was not yielding. For the first time in the conflict, Lee was compelled to respond to Union engagements rather than dictating the war's trajectory. The two armies hastened towards Spotsylvania Courthouse, with Lee's troops arriving just in time to impede Grant's progress. The ensuing conflict endured for 2 weeks, during which both sides constructed extensive earthworks and engaged in some of the war's most ferocious fighting. The engagement reached its peak on May 12th, at a vulnerable point in the Confederate line known as the Bloody Angle, where hand-to-hand combat persisted for 20 hours. The fighting at the Bloody Angle was so intense that a 22-inch oak tree was felled solely by rifle fire. Soldiers fought with bayonets, rifle butts, and even their bare hands in trenches inundated with mud and gore. One participant characterized the event as the most horrific 20 hours in the annals of warfare, with casualties so immense that the deceased were piled 3 deep in some locations. Grant's casualties sustained during the Wilderness and Spotsylvania campaigns were staggering, exceeding 36,000 in less than 2 weeks. Northern newspapers began branding him, quote, "1," and calls for his dismissal intensified. Nevertheless, Lincoln stood by his general, comprehending that Grant was finally exerting the kind of pressure necessary to break the Confederacy's will to fight. The campaign proceeded with the Battle of Cold Harbor on June 3rd, where Grant ordered a direct assault on Lee's fortified positions, resulting in 7,000 Union casualties in under an hour. This was Grant's most severe tactical defeat, and he later expressed regret over ordering the attack. Yet even this calamity did not divert him from his ultimate objective, the annihilation of Lee's army. Unable to breach Lee's defenses, Grant executed an ingenious strategic maneuver, relocating his entire army across the James River to threaten Petersburg, the vital railroad junction supplying Richmond. If Petersburg were to fall, the Confederate capital would become indefensible, and Lee's army would be forced to retreat or face starvation. This move caught Lee off guard and nearly succeeded, but Confederate reinforcements arrived in the nick of time to secure the city. The initial failure to capture Petersburg precipitated a siege that would persist for 10 months. Both armies constructed elaborate trench systems extending for miles around the city, foreshadowing the Western Front of World War I. The siege warfare presented a novel experience for American soldiers who had to adapt to life in sodden trenches under constant threat from sharpshooters and artillery. While Grant was relentlessly engaging Lee's army in Virginia, Sherman was prosecuting his own campaign in Georgia. The march to Atlanta was a paradigm of maneuver warfare, with Sherman utilizing his superior numbers to outmaneuver Confederate positions rather than confronting them directly. General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding Confederate forces in Georgia, conducted a skillful fighting withdrawal, but was unable to halt Sherman's advance. Jefferson Davis, exasperated by Johnston's defensive strategy, replaced him with John Bell Hood, an aggressive officer who had lost a leg at Chickamauga. Hood immediately adopted an offensive posture, launching a series of assaults against Sherman's forces near Atlanta. However, Hood's attacks were poorly coordinated and yielded costly failures, weakening his army without achieving any strategic goals. Sherman's capture of Atlanta on September 2, 1864, marked a pivotal triumph for the Union cause. The city was a significant industrial center and railroad hub, and its capitulation dealt a severe blow to Confederate morale. More critically for Lincoln, this victory occurred merely 2 months prior to the presidential election, significantly aiding his re-election prospects. The Democratic Party had nominated George B. McClellan, Grant's predecessor, as commander of the Army of the PTOAC, on a platform advocating an immediate armistice and peace negotiations. McClellan himself was not a peace advocate, but his running mate and many of his supporters favored ending the war, even if it meant Confederate independence. Lincoln's re-election was far from guaranteed. The war had endured much longer than anticipated, and casualties mounted daily. Draft riots had erupted in New York City the preceding year, and opposition to the war was growing among working-class Democrats who objected to fighting for the liberation of enslaved people who might compete with them for employment. However, Sherman's triumph at Atlanta fundamentally altered the political landscape. Suddenly, it appeared the Union was prevailing in the war, and voters were reluctant to change leadership at such a critical juncture. Lincoln secured a decisive victory, carrying all but 3 states and obtaining 55% of the popular vote. The election served as a referendum on the war, and the American populace had opted to see it through to victory. Lincoln's re-election ensured the continuation of the war until the Confederacy's complete defeat and the abolition of slavery. In his second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, Lincoln adopted a conciliatory tone while affirming his resolve to finalize the work of emancipation. "With malice toward none, with charity for all," he declared, "let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." Yet, before reconciliation could be achieved, the Confederacy had to be utterly vanquished. Sherman's march to the sea, commencing after the fall of Atlanta, was designed to shatter the South's resolve to continue fighting. Sherman's 60,000 troops carved a 60-mile-wide path of devastation across Georgia, destroying railroads, factories, and any assets that could sustain the Confederate war effort. The march was controversial, even among Union sympathizers who questioned the morality of waging war against civilians. Nevertheless, Sherman believed that the South's civilian population was an integral component of the war effort, akin to its soldiers, and that undermining their morale was essential to concluding the conflict. "War is hell," he famously stated, and he was determined to make the South experience its full intensity. Sherman's army reached Savannah on December 21, 1864, concluding a march of 300 miles in just over a month. The city surrendered without a fight, and Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, quote, "Twee." The march to the sea was followed by an even more destructive campaign through South Carolina, the state that had initiated the war. Sherman's troops, many of whom held South Carolina accountable for the conflict, exhibited particular harshness in their treatment of the state. Columbia, the state capital, was set ablaze, although whether by accident or design remains a subject of historical debate. The devastation of South Carolina signaled the Confederacy's impending demise. Lee's army was trapped in the trenches surrounding Petersburg, gradually succumbing to starvation and attrition. Johnston's army in North Carolina was too depleted to impede Sherman's advance. The Confederate government was preparing to evacuate Richmond, and discussions were underway regarding the continuation of the war as a guerrilla conflict in the mountains. However, Lee recognized that further resistance would only inflict additional suffering upon the South. His army had dwindled to fewer than 30,000 effective men, many of them shoeless and famished. Desertions were increasing daily as soldiers deserted to return to their families. The cause was lost, and Lee was aware of it. The conclusion arrived abruptly in April 1865. Grant's final offensive breached Lee's lines at Petersburg, compelling the Confederate Army to abandon its positions and attempt a westward retreat. However, Union cavalry and infantry intercepted Lee's escape routes. And on April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered his army to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The surrender ceremony was conducted with decorum and respect for the vanquished Confederates. Grant prohibited his men from celebrating, stating, quote, "Full 4. Lee's soldiers were permitted to retain their horses and sidearms, and they were provided with provisions from Union supplies. It was a magnanimous peace that mirrored Lincoln's desire for reconciliation." Nevertheless, Lincoln would not live to witness the fruition of his benevolence. On April 14, 1865, a mere 5 days after Lee's surrender, the president was fatally shot by actor John Wilkes Booth while attending a theatrical performance at Ford's Theater. Lincoln succumbed the following morning, becoming a martyr for the cause of union and freedom that he had championed throughout the war. The assassination of Lincoln represented a profound tragedy for the nation, and, particularly, for the South. Lincoln had advocated for a lenient approach to Reconstruction, aiming for a swift reintegration of the Southern states into the Union with minimal penalties. His successor, Andrew Johnson, however, lacked Lincoln's political acumen and moral authority, and the Reconstruction era became characterized by enduring animosity and conflict. The American Civil War officially concluded on May 26, 1865, with the surrender of the final Confederate forces. The conflict's toll was staggering: over 600,000 fatalities, millions more wounded, and widespread devastation across entire regions. Nevertheless, the Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, and the United States emerged as a modern nation-state with a strengthened federal government. The war fundamentally reshaped American society. The federal government assumed powers previously unimaginable, including the authority to conscript soldiers, issue paper currency, and regulate the economy. The industrial capacity developed to support the war effort subsequently propelled America's rise as a global power in the ensuing decades. For African Americans, the war brought freedom, but not parity. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the 14th and 15th Amendments guaranteed citizenship and suffrage. However, the promise of Reconstruction was undermined by the Compromise of 1877, which relinquished federal protection of black rights in exchange for Republican presidential victory. The Civil War resolved foundational national questions: the perpetual nature of the Union and the incompatibility of slavery with American ideals of liberty and equality. Yet, it also introduced new debates concerning governmental authority, the definition of citizenship, and the essence of American democracy, issues that would continue to challenge the nation for generations. The spring of 1865 found the Confederacy in its death throes, though few were prepared to acknowledge it. Richmond, the proud Confederate capital, was under siege, its streets thronged with refugees, wounded soldiers, and the anxious families of Confederate officials. The government that had aspired to independence now focused solely on daily survival. Confederate President Jefferson Davis remained defiant, even as his nation disintegrated. He spoke of relocating the government southward and continuing resistance as a guerrilla campaign. These were merely the fantasies of a man unable to accept defeat. The reality was that the Confederacy had ceased to function as a nation. Its armies were dispersed, its treasury depleted, and its populace ravaged by 4 years of calamitous warfare. Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia in the trenches around Petersburg, possessed a clearer grasp of the situation than his president. His once formidable army had dwindled to fewer than 30,000 effectives, many clad in rags, gaunt, and armed with outdated weaponry. Desertions escalated daily as soldiers absconded to rejoin their families and tend their farms. The siege of Petersburg had endured through the winter of 1864-1865, with both armies enduring the hardships of trench warfare. The Confederate lines, stretching 37 miles around the city, were far too extensive for Lee's depleted forces to defend adequately. Meanwhile, Grant relentlessly extended his lines westward, compelling Lee to stretch his army thinner and thinner. The end commenced on March 29, 1865, when Grant launched his final offensive. The Battle of Five Forks, on April 1st, shattered the Confederate right flank, severing the last rail line into Petersburg. Lee's position became untenable, prompting him to order the evacuation of both Petersburg and Richmond. The fall of Richmond sent shockwaves throughout the South. The city that had symbolized Confederate defiance for 4 years now lay in Union hands, its government buildings occupied by black soldiers who had once been enslaved. Abraham Lincoln himself visited the captured capital on April 4th, traversing the streets once graced by Jefferson Davis. Lee's army, in desperate retreat westward from Petersburg, was in dire straits. The soldiers had been inadequately fed for weeks, and many were too weakened to march effectively. Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan, harassed the retreating columns, while Grant's infantry pursued closely. It was a race against time, with Lee aiming to reach the mountains of western Virginia to continue the fight. However, Grant's forces proved faster and better provisioned. At the Battle of Sailor's Creek on April the 6th, Union troops captured nearly 8,000 Confederate soldiers, including several generals. Lee's army was disintegrating, with entire units surrendering en masse. The once proud Army of Northern Virginia, renowned for its victories against overwhelming odds, was finally defeated. On the morning of April 9, 1865, Lee found his escape route blocked by Union cavalry at Appomattox Courthouse. A final Confederate infantry charge briefly breached the Union lines, but it was too late. Grant's infantry was arriving in overwhelming numbers, cutting off Lee's last avenue of escape. The Confederate commander faced a grim choice: surrender or witness his remaining men slaughtered in a futile engagement. Lee opted for surrender, dispatching a white flag to Grant's lines and requesting a meeting to discuss terms. The two generals convened in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's home, the same man who had fled Bull Run 4 years prior to escape the war, only to have it conclude in his new residence. The irony was not lost on observers, who noted that the war had begun in McLean's backyard and ended in his front parlor. Grant's terms were generous, reflecting Lincoln's desire for a magnanimous peace. Confederate officers were permitted to retain their sidearms and personal belongings, while enlisted men could keep their horses for spring plowing. No one would face prosecution for treason, and all would be allowed to return home provided they obeyed the law. It was a far more lenient surrender than Lee could have reasonably anticipated. The formal surrender ceremony occurred on April 12th, with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top, selected to receive the Confederate surrender. As the Confederate units marched past to lay down their arms and surrender their battle flags, Chamberlain ordered his men to present arms and salute their defeated adversaries. This gesture of respect helped initiate the process of reconciliation between North and South. However, even as Lee surrendered at Appomattox, a profound tragedy unfolded in Washington. John Wilkes Booth, a prominent actor and Confederate sympathizer, had initially plotted to kidnap Lincoln and exchange him for Confederate prisoners. When this plan failed, Booth resolved to assassinate Lincoln, believing that his death would somehow rekindle the Confederate cause. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. The president was in good spirits, having just received news of Lee's surrender. Earlier that day, he had outlined his plans for Reconstruction, emphasizing reconciliation and healing over punishment for the defeated South. Booth entered the presidential box during the play's third act, timing his entrance to coincide with the audience's laughter, which would mask the sound of his pistol. He shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a single-shot derringer, then leaped onto the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia. Booth fractured his leg during the jump, but managed to escape on horseback. Lincoln was transported to a boarding house across the street from the theater, where physicians examined his wound and declared it fatal. The bullet had lodged in his brain, and 19th-century medicine offered no recourse. Throughout the night, government officials, family members, and friends kept vigil as the president succumbed. Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, becoming the first American president to be assassinated. His death sent shockwaves across the nation and the world. The man who had preserved the Union and liberated the enslaved had been struck down at the zenith of his triumph. The assassination was part of a broader conspiracy that included attacks on other government officials. Lewis Powell, one of Booth's Confederates, severely injured Secretary of State William Seward in his home, while George Atzerodt was tasked with assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson, but lost his nerve. The plot to decapitate the Union government largely failed, but Lincoln's death was catastrophe enough. Booth was tracked down and killed by Union soldiers on April 26, 1865, in a tobacco barn in Virginia. His co-conspirators were apprehended, tried by military tribunal, and 4 were executed, including Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the federal government. This swift retribution reflected the nation's outrage and thirst for vengeance. Lincoln's death was mourned across the North, and by many in the South, who recognized the loss of their best chance for a lenient Reconstruction. The president's body was conveyed by funeral train from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, with millions of Americans lining the tracks to pay their respects. It was the largest funeral in American history up to that point. The assassination elevated Lincoln to martyrdom, solidifying his status as one of America's most revered presidents. The man who had been widely reviled during his lifetime was now seen as the great emancipator who had perished for the cause of freedom. His death also ensured that Reconstruction would proceed more harshly than he had intended, as radical Republicans gained control of the process. Andrew Johnson, who assumed the presidency following Lincoln's death, was a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union. However, he lacked Lincoln's political acumen and moral gravitas, and his accommodating policies towards the South quickly led to friction with Congress. The Reconstruction era would be characterized by intense political disputes that would persist for over a decade. The war officially concluded on May 26, 1865, with the final surrender of Confederate forces in Texas. Yet, the process of national reunification required considerably more time. The South lay in ruins, its cities charred, its railways obliterated, and its economy in disarray. The undertaking of Reconstruction demanded immense exertion and resources. The human toll of the conflict was devastating. More than 620,000 Americans perished, exceeding the combined death toll of all other American wars. Hundreds of thousands more sustained injuries, with many suffering permanent disabilities. Entire families were annihilated, and the demographic repercussions would be felt across generations. The economic cost was equally substantial. The federal government expended over $3 billion on the war, accumulating a national debt that would take decades to liquidate. The Southern economy was utterly decimated, with a collapse in property values and the abrupt abolition of the labor system founded on slavery. Nevertheless, the war also ushered in positive transformations. Slavery was irrevocably abolished, fulfilling the Declaration of Independence's pledge that all individuals are created equal. The federal government's stature grew, modernized with new institutions and capacities that would serve the nation effectively in the industrial age. The conflict also hastened technological and social shifts already in motion. The railroad network experienced expansion and improvement. Telegraphs facilitated communication across vast distances, and novel manufacturing techniques were developed. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and their contributions to the war effort began to alter perceptions of their capabilities and rights. For African Americans, the war brought liberty but not parity. The 13th Amendment eradicated slavery, yet the pursuit of civil rights would persist for another century. The aspirations of Reconstruction were undermined by the Compromise of 1877, which relinquished federal protection of black rights in exchange for Republican presidential control. The Civil War resolved the foundational issues that had troubled the nation since its inception. The Union was affirmed as perpetual and indivisible, and no state possessed the right to secede. Slavery was deemed incompatible with American principles and was permanently abolished. The federal government's supremacy over the states was established, and the Constitution was declared the land's supreme law. However, the war also gave rise to new inquiries concerning the essence of American democracy and the definition of citizenship. The amplification of federal authority during the war established precedents that would justify further governmental intervention in economic and social spheres. The struggle for racial equity would continue long after the cessation of hostilities. The memory of the Civil War would profoundly shape American politics and culture for generations. Veterans associations emerged as influential political entities, and the Grand Army of the Republic would contribute to the election of Republican presidents for decades. The "mi quote duraos" narrative would romanticize the Confederacy and legitimize the system of racial segregation that succeeded slavery. The battlegrounds where countless Americans met their end became hallowed sites, preserved as national parks and memorials to the sacrifices of those who fought and died. Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, and numerous other locations evolved into pilgrimage destinations for Americans seeking to comprehend their history and honor their forebears. The Civil War stands as the defining event in American history, transforming the United States from a loose confederation of states into a modern nation. The country that emerged from the war was stronger, more cohesive, and more devoted to the principles of freedom and equality. Yet, it was also deeply scarred by the experience, and its wounds would require generations to heal. As the cannons fell silent and the soldiers returned home, Americans confronted the immense challenge of rebuilding their nation. The physical devastation could be mended with time and effort, but the psychological and emotional scars proved more enduring. The war had concluded, but its impact would resonate for generations. The American Civil War was a tragedy of immense magnitude, yet it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. During the conflict's direst moments, Americans displayed extraordinary bravery, resolve, and sacrifice. They fought not merely for territory or political dominion, but for their profound convictions regarding freedom, equality, and the nature of governance. The war tested the American democratic experiment and found it sufficiently robust to withstand even the most severe trials. The Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, and the nation emerged more robust and unified than ever. This victory was purchased with considerable bloodshed and expense. Nevertheless, it was a triumph that benefited not only Americans, but people globally who regard the United States as a symbol of freedom and democracy. The narrative of the American Civil War is fundamentally a story about the potency of ideas and the readiness of people to relinquish everything for their beliefs. It serves as a reminder that freedom is never without cost, that democracy demands continuous vigilance and effort to sustain, and that the price of liberty is perpetual watchfulness. The men and women who fought and perished in that monumental conflict bequeathed a legacy that we must never forget, and a responsibility we must never evade. As we reflect on the American Civil War today, we honor not only the soldiers who fought and died, but all those who labored to safeguard the Union and extend the advantages of freedom to all Americans. Their sacrifice was not in vain, for they helped forge a nation that, despite its imperfections and setbacks, remains a beacon of hope and freedom to the world. The war that fractured America ultimately strengthened it,